Well, good morning, everyone. This is Deacon Jeremiah here. It's good to see all of you, and we have an excellent turnout, which is always encouraging. This is our third session in a series, an ongoing series, a year-long series called Keeping Faith in the Shadowlands. And so we're drawing from all sorts of perspectives. It's been rich. We heard from Father Bruce Wolke and his meditation on the Psalms. We heard from Jenny Shute, who is an accomplished artist. And so I love the ways in which we're taking a look at the Christian life from many different angles and perspectives. As a deacon, I often have conversations with parishioners, and there are moments where I have a conversation with one of you and I'm like, I wish the whole church was here to engage in this sort of dialogue and discussion and insight. And I've had numerous conversations of that caliber with my friend Nate Herzog. And he's here today to talk to us about Confucianism, Confucianism as it relates to the Christian faith and vice versa. And the first observation I just want to make is, I am a thoroughly Western Christian, Anglo-Saxon, and the tradition, I get the philosophical tradition from continental Europe and the theologians of, whether it's Augustine or Thomas Aquinas. And when I go to conferences, I marvel that when I talk to my colleagues, there is a natural interplay between the philosophy of the Greco-Roman world. So my colleagues will easily speak of Platonism and of Stoicism from Marcus Aurelius and Aristotle, and readily incorporate that into a lot of robust theological discussion. We largely attributed this to Thomas Aquinas. Thomas Aquinas, a medieval theologian who synthesized in the minds of many Aristotelian thought and a kind of commitment to empiricism with Christian orthodoxy. And I just wonder, as we increasingly see Christianity bloom and come to full flower in the global South and in the East, if similar dialogue is important as we think about Eastern philosophers and as they relate to Christian orthodoxy and the revelation of Scripture. And this is the sort of dialogue I've had with Nate, and I've been enriched by it and enlivened by it. It's made my vision of the world so much richer and bigger. And so without further ado, Nate, we'd love to hear from you. Thank you, sir.
Thank you for that lovely intro. Thank you for tracing out the Western descent. I'm glad I don't have to deal with the Marcus Aurelius sad boy poetry hours myself. Hello, everyone. My name is Nate Herzog. If you don't know me, my wife Esther and I have been going to Advent since 2017, I believe. So I know I've met quite a lot of you in person, but not all of you. And I hope to see all of you soon when we resume in-person speaking. So obviously, if you look at me, you can tell I am not entirely white and not entirely Asian. I was born here in America. My mother was born in Vietnam, in the Republic of Vietnam, better known to you probably as South Vietnam, which is a Confucian society on explicitly Confucian lines. My mother grew up Confucian, and my mother raised me Confucian, which is an interesting thing to say. And I would like to start on that note. And allow me to share my screen, pull up my presentation, and we will begin. So, when I say that I'm raised Confucian, that is a kind of an interesting thing to say. What exactly does that mean? And in talking with my mother, one of the things that she thought very interesting about that was that she didn't necessarily even agree with that statement, because Confucianism is a very different sort of thing from Westernisms. There's no central authority or governing body. So no one's in charge of Confucianism. There isn't a president or a pope or a central committee or some sort of strict orthodoxy. There isn't really a required reading for it. So many of you have probably heard of the Analects, and some people talk about that as sort of the Confucian Bible. That is not correct at all for two reasons. One is when you say the Confucian Bible, one, it implies a theological aspect, obviously, and also a completeness. And neither of those are there. So if you read the Analects, what you will get is a set of 2 and 3 line sayings and statements that are put together in no particular order. And the reason for that is that these are the highlights of other important interactions that either Confucius or his followers had with people. And the greater story around those is the thing you need to know. So it's not a complete text. It's a greatest hits compilation. The Analects is, now that's what I call Confucius, volumes 1 through 21. And if you just read it in without any sort of commentary just by itself, you're essentially reading a table of contents. You'll get some of the idea, but it's not really there. The other thing about Confucianism is that it doesn't quite match any categories of philosophical thought that we have in the West, right? So people say, well, is it a political thing, a social thing? To what degree is there a religious aspect to it? It doesn't really match up to any of these categories that we use in the West. I will say right off the bat, a lot of people think of Confucianism as a religion, and that is not correct. Now, the short answer is no, it's not a religion. The longer answer is, well, what is a religion to you? Is a social movement or a political philosophy a religion? I think we can all think of somebody from our social media feed for whom it very much is, but in theory, it shouldn't be, and for most people, it's not. I would encourage you to think of Confucianism in the same way. Confucius himself is very, very clear that he does not know anything about metaphysics. He does not have anything to say about the hereafter or the ultimate nature or about divinity or any of this. Obviously, as humans, we want to hear things like that, but as far as Confucianism itself, there is nothing that has to be in there. So if there's no specific texts, if there's nobody in charge, how do we know what it is? How can I possibly tell you about this thing? I think the best way is to begin at the beginning. So Confucius himself, he was born in 551 in Shandong province in China. If you don't know where that is, you don't need to know specifically where it is. The important thing is this is 551 BC, right? This is a long time ago. And at the time Confucius was born, Chinese society is already unspeakably old. If you know anything about Chinese history, you know about the dynastic cycle where there's a dynasty, right? They rise up, they're in charge. At some point, they lose their mojo, they get replaced by another dynasty, and the cycle continues. At the point where Confucius is living, this cycle is already stretching back into the mists of time. It goes back beyond written historical records, and we don't actually know how long it goes back. There is a dynasty that is called the Xia dynasty that Confucius knows all about, his contemporaries know all about. They could tell you the history, the customs, the important people, names and dates, all this stuff about this dynasty. But there's no historical or archaeological evidence otherwise that this dynasty even existed. So is it an invented tradition? Have we just not found the right stuff yet? Maybe we found them and they're sitting uncatalogued in some museum storehouse somewhere, who knows? The point is that the world already in 500 BC is unspeakably old and very constant in the world that Confucius is born in. And also, his given name is Confucius. I've written it here. You don't need to know all of the characters, but Confucius is a Latinization of a title that he's given, Master Kong. And master here is an academic term, so it's sort of, like doctor. So when people come to Confucius and, somebody approaches Confucius as master, I wish to know blah, blah, blah. This is the same way of saying, well, Dr. Kong, what are your thoughts on this and that? It is an academic title. He is an academic man. And his father is a minor bureaucrat, and he dies when Confucius is 3. And Confucius is brought up in poverty. He is educated just as a common person. He doesn't have access to any sort of special knowledge or elite tutoring. And this is something Confucius will bring up over and over again, is he says, I'm not special. I am not especially virtuous or especially smart. I do not have any advantages. The only thing I have going for me is that I love to learn and I pay attention to the ancients, and that's it. And I've included here a nice picture of Confucius's ancestral tomb in his homeland, in his hometown. You can see, nice looking place. So that is Confucius and the time. And as I said, the dynastic cycle at this point is already extremely old. But typically it's been a very quick thing. One dynasty, they lose their way, they're pretty much immediately supplanted, and now meet the new boss, same as the old boss. But something new is happening in Confucius's time. There is a decline, a decay. So the current dynasty, the Zhou dynasty, is falling apart. And there's a nice helpful Wikipedia map here. The little star is Confucius' birthplace. You can see all of these little provinces, all of these little micro-states that are emerging. So in theory, the king of the Zhou dynasty, he's still the king in theory. But in reality, all of these little places are starting to go into business for themselves. If you read anything about this, often translations will use titles like the Duke of this or the Count of that to try to use that European feudal symbolism to try to convey what's going on, that you have these people who are supposedly subordinate, but in reality, they're kind of starting to do their own thing. They're starting to develop their own way of thinking of themselves. They're independent. They're trying to rank themselves relatively. And with that comes a lot of internal conflict. Wars and violence are increasing, so increasing numbers of fortification and military spending, which means more forced labor, more taxation, which means more bandits, more poverty, more famines. Right? The world is progressively falling apart. And for the people who are living here in this civilization, in this time, this is not the way it's supposed to be happening. And they're trying to figure out what is going wrong. This is sometimes called the Spring and Autumn period, after a set of chronicles called the Spring and Autumn Annals. That is, according to a tradition written by Confucius himself, that gives the history of this time. It's also called the 100 Schools of Thought, because there are lots and lots and lots of Chinese thinkers trying to figure out what is to be done. Right? What went wrong with the world? How did we end up here? And how are we going to get out of this mess? And there are a lot of philosophies, and it's everything you could possibly think of. Some people think, we need to get back to nature. Some people think we need a spiritual awakening. We need to be more mystical and arcane. We need to focus on empowering one of these rulers to conquer everyone else and then restore order. So Confucius is one guy who's got some thoughts among many people who have some thoughts about what we're going to do. So Confucius, this is the premise of Confucius's thought, right? He is trying to fix the problem of society. So one, history is cyclical, right? History is not fundamentally going anywhere. In Western thought, there's this idea of, the right side of history, or, the inevitable progress towards a certain destination. And obviously, within a Christian context, we can say, okay, right, there's an almighty God, he started it, at some point, he's gonna end it, and that kind of makes sense. But without that context, right, even the Western society without that context still is trying to hold on to that teleological aspect, right? History is going somewhere, despite the fact that they don't acknowledge anyone is in charge of it and no one is directing it. How is it directed? What is this conflict? Confucius, right, he says, no, history is cyclical, right? People are not going to change. The fundamental nature of humanity is not going to change. Nothing is new under the sun, as the Hebrews would say. And so for the solution, he's looking at a high level, long-term solution. He doesn't want to just get a quick fix that, oh yeah, that'll be good for a generation or two, but then fall apart. He wants a solution that will last across this long cyclical history that can remain the same indefinitely. So this has to work across the entirety of society. The other thing is a focus on the here and the now. Confucius does not have any time for metaphysics. He refuses to talk about the supernatural or spirits. There's a great story where one scholar comes to Confucius and says, Master, I wish to know what happens after death. And Confucius says, you do not yet understand life. How could I speak to you of death? And the student says, well, Master, I simply wish to better please the spirits of the ancestors. And Confucius says, you cannot yet please the living. How could you hope to please the dead? And obviously, Confucius is being a little rough with this guy, because at this point in history, you should know better than to ask Confucius about any of this stuff. He's made it very clear. He's not going to talk about the afterlife. He is not going to engage in any sort of metaphysical philosophy. It is strictly focused on society, on the world around us. Another saying of his is, I transmit, I do not innovate. Confucius doesn't see himself as a guy who's coming up with anything new. He's just getting back to what has worked before, right? We have Confucius living in a time where the cycles are already unspeakably ancient, and it's worked all this time. So it's the new stuff that we've been trying to do lately that's obviously thrown it off. We have to get back to what worked. The other thing is connection, and I want to harp on this point a little bit more. Part of Confucianism is a notion of connection between things, and that is, I think, a little bit difficult to explain to Westerners. So, got a little graph for you. In the Western context, a lot of Western philosophy is about focusing on the thing itself, right? We want to isolate it. How can we analyze? What's the category of this thing? How do we zoom all the way into the specific thing itself? Right? No extraneous. How do we Zoom all the way in. If the classification doesn't match exactly, we need to create a new, smaller classification, ever more specific, ever more minute, until we arrive at just the nature of the thing in itself. Now, in the Confucian context, you can't do that, because the way we understand things in a Confucian way is that things exist in context, things exist in relation. If you pull something out of that context and try to analyze it, you've lost something. You can't meaningfully do that. Things can only exist when they are situated. So there is not an interest in categories, and there's not an interest in division and classification so much in Confucianism. And there's kind of a distrust of spending too much time trying to parse these things down to a smaller thing, because you're losing what's really important when you do that. The place this really shows up most importantly is in the self. And this draws a pretty sharp contrast to the Greek understanding of the self. So the Confucian self, as you said, it's relational. You are a person, you exist in relation with other people. We can't meaningfully talk about you outside of that relation. Now, I mean, as Christians, this shouldn't be too hard to understand. When I say we are the body of Christ, right? Shouldn't be too much pushback on that. And a lot of us think, oh yeah, of course, of course we're the body of Christ, right? But I'm a cool part of the body, right? I'm not like a lame part, but we are all the body of Christ. We all exist in a certain relation, and we all can only function in that relation context. The other thing is that it's known externally. So what I mean by this is that repeatedly people ask Confucius, well, how do I know if somebody is virtuous? And Confucius says, observe them. What do they do, right? How do they behave? What are their actions? When people ask Confucius, what about so-and-so? Is he virtuous? Confucius will say, well, I see what he does, right? He does this and this and this. That is virtuous. Or, oh, he does this and that. That is not virtuous, right? There is not a sense of being good, only of doing good. To put this another way, a kind of a running joke in our household is the little person inside of you. I always bring this up because in Western thought, there's this idea I have a true secret me inside of myself. And it's no one else can see it. No one else can interact with it. It cannot be changed. I myself can only vaguely communicate with this true little person inside of me. And that's the real me. And I have to obey that little unchangeable, inscrutable person inside of me. That sounds weird. And obviously, I'm exaggerating for the important sake of making fun of my wife's culture. But it is, it is weird, right? Can only be a self that we can interact with. Let me rephrase that. Unless we can interact with the self, right? How can we really even know it? How can we really even talk about it? So Confucius says, I have no time for any sort of secret inner person. You are what you do. The self is also, I'd say, simple and holistic. What I mean by simple is that it is not composed of multiple parts. So oftentimes when we're talking in the Western context, I've got, in my heart says this, but my mind says this, my soul says this. I remember once in high school, I was talking with some friends who were talking about, well, what's the difference? What's the division? How do we divide up the heart versus the mind versus the soul? And just when they'd finally arrived at something, another guy came in with spirit, and I had to start all over again. And I was just like, how many of these things do you guys have, right? There's just the self, and you have an inner self, and that's it. Obviously, there are, emotional appeals. There are things that speak to you a little bit more logically, but you can't meaningfully pull those out of their context. There is no such thing as, just emotion, just logic. There is no difference between heart, mind, soul, whatever it is you want. There's just the inner self, and something that speaks to you speaks to that entire self. The other thing is that the self is changeable. So back to that, Western idea of the little person inside of you, right? That the true me is just, it is what it is, right? There's no two ways about it. Well, no, Confucius says, you are a certain way, but you can be changed. And in fact, you need to be changed. Frequently, when we talk about cultivating virtue, right? That's, an agricultural metaphor. There's a lot of use of metaphors to seeds and growing, a lot of use of metaphors of craftsmanship, fine art. There's this idea of the self needs to be worked on in order to be useful at this societal level. So we talked about these, you exist in relation. There's basically 5 kinds of relation that Confucius has. Here they are: ruler to subject, parent to child, husband to wife, elder sibling to younger sibling, and friend to friend. Now, if you look at these, you will notice what the fashionable thinkers in modern culture call a power dynamic. Ooh, Westerners, we don't like power dynamics. They don't like hierarchy. That makes people very uncomfortable. Confucius, no, he's all about understanding the power dynamic, understanding the hierarchy, because that is part of the context. And if you pretend it's not there, you are not going to be able to perform your relationship correctly. Now, again, these relationships are outward oriented. So your relationship is a two-way thing, but for your perspective, you're focusing on the other person. The other person is focusing on you. The relationship is fundamentally about your relationship to the other person, not about the other person's relationship to you. You are always oriented towards the other person. The easiest way to explain this is to look at the most important relation in Confucian thought, the family relation. You may have heard this term before, filial piety. This is another term that makes Westerners, Americans especially, very uncomfortable. Ooh, filial piety. Is that ancestor worship stuff I hear about? Ooh, what does that mean? Piety here is more in the original Latin term of like dutifulness. And I'm going to quote from a guy named Lin Yutang. Lin Yutang is a fantastic Chinese author. He was born right at the beginning of the 20th century. His father is a Lutheran pastor. He knows all the stuff that Westerners know. He knows all of the Lutheran orthodoxy, and he is really, really good at putting stuff into terms that make sense for Westerners. And he's also a very charming, pleasant writer. He also invented the first mass production Chinese typewriter. Fascinating guy. What he says is, you should hear piety in the spirit that the Hebrews hear the fear of the Lord. That is to say, right? Filial piety is not about family duty. All right, I got to do this, I got to do that. I got to do this for my mom, that for my dad. And then once I'm done, checked off the boxes, you got the rest of the day to yourself. I've done my duty. It's not a set of tasks. It's a posture with which we live life. Right? The fundamental understanding of life is as part of the family unit. The family unit is the basis of society. So no, it's not the individual is the basic unit of society. The family is the basic unit of society. And Confucius very firmly believes if you can get the family right, then everything else will follow. The same processes that lead you to achieving correct filial piety will necessarily lead you to behaving virtuously in other areas. So at one point, someone asks him, hey, why are you not having a government post right now? You got all these opinions about society. And he says, well, in being a filial son and a good brother, I'm already taking part in government. He also says filial piety is the root of goodness. If you can get this right, you get everything else right. And filial piety really exemplifies this two-way relationship, right? The children obey and respect the parents. And this is in a very, very total sense, much beyond even kind of conservative Western ideas about obeying and honoring your parents. At the same time, the parents also have an extreme duty of care towards the children. Again, going much beyond even the most conservative Western ideas. It's a very strong bond. It is a two-way relationship because this is the basic unit of society. We can't have parents without children. We can't have children without parents. These are not meaningful positions in people unless they are in the context of family. And you can take this exact rubric and apply it to every single other kind of relation, just in a somewhat less intense way. The relationship between teacher and student is very similar to the relationship between parent and child, right? Although not quite as intense. The relationship between ruler and subject, very similar to parent-child, but not quite so intense. So again, reciprocity is an important word. Reciprocity in all these relationships. There is a two-way exchange. There is obedience and support. There is extreme care and self-sacrifice from the top. An important analog that I would draw, right? When it says in the epistles, right, husbands love your wives, wives submit to your husbands. I had a lot of Westerners hear that and they kind of I got to chew on that for a minute. I remember once I was explaining to this to a old Chinese man in China. I was explaining to him in Chinese, and he's like, I don't understand. How does this work? And I basically said, it's this concept. It's reciprocity, right? They are both putting themselves under the other to achieve the good of the other, back and forth. And as soon as I said that, he said, oh, yes, I understand completely. And that was it. You got it. That this is a very easy thing to map back and forth onto there if you already understand this concept of reciprocity and of self-sacrifice and the extreme duty of care. So we know our context. We know what the basic unit is, but like, what do we actually do? How do we know what to do? Well, there's two basic poles to this. One is ritual. Ritual here is a very broad term. So when you say ritual, often we think of altars and chanting and all this sort of thing. A very broad thing. So the Book of Ritual, which is this kind of classic book, it talks about everything from, yes, altars and chanting, to table manners, to dressing, right? Everything has an important, correct way to be done. And that often doesn't really make sense to the Western context. So the analogy I like to use is the handshake. That is our greeting ritual. And this analogy has only become more potent over the last year. Historically, right, you meet someone, if it's in a formal context, right, there's a handshake. Reach out, shake the hand, bam, we have met, the ritual is done. But in an informal context, I don't know how often this has happened to you, right? You meet someone, oh, hey, there's so-and-so, and their hand kind of goes up, right? And you have to make a call. Is that a handshake, or are they going up for like a high five or just a wave? Is it a hug? Are they going to try to like pull it in and clasp hands and tuck it and do some kind of cool thing? You got to make a choice. And if you make the wrong choice, if you see one person thinks they're doing a high five and one person thinks they're doing a hug, it's awkward. Ooh. And obviously it's not the end of the world, but it makes living in context with each other harder. It makes being part of a society harder because we have confusion, we have awkwardness, we don't know what we're doing. And obviously in the last year, if you've met someone in the last year, what do you do, right? And clearly we're not going to shake hands. Are we gonna wave, or is there an elbow bump? What's going on? So this sort of confusion and this sort of uncertainty about how we are to behave, right, can apply to any sort of prescribed activity within society. Obviously, yeah, you're going to lose a bit of your self-expression in saying hello, but in return, you gain a nice, smooth greeting ritual, and then you can get into doing, what you actually want to do, talking to this person for whatever purpose. So this basic rubric applies to everything else. The other thing about ritual is that it shapes our thoughts, it shapes who we are, and this is a way in which it's easier to talk to Anglicans than it is to talk to, say, charismatics, because this is liturgy, right? We understand this. Doing things in a certain way, it's not just to do it that way, right? The basic actions we take help shape who we are. Right? When the gospel comes into our midst for the gospel reading, right, that is something that understand, that affects us, even if we don't consciously think, oh yeah, the word is coming into our midst. Right? The fact that it does helps form who we are and helps form our understanding. So I have here a quote from Confucius: someone who is broadly learned with regard to culture and whose conduct is restrained by the rites can be counted on not to go astray. Right? The ritual helps provide a nice channel for which you can conduct your actions. It takes away the uncertainty and the awkwardness, and it helps shape us into better behavior. So remember, again, Confucius is concerned about society. This is not a metaphysical thing. This is society. How do we have social order? We have to have social standards. There has to be a correct way to do things. The other thing about having rituals is that the rituals that it gives us continuity, right? The people who came before us did it this way. The people who came before them did it this way. The people who come after us will do it this way. It again emphasizes this pact that we are part of something bigger than just the individual. We all exist in a context. And that context isn't just the people we see around us every day, but the people who came before, the people who came after. There is a point at which somebody tries to finagle Confucius into fortune telling. So people come up, oh, we're going to look at our ritual bones and tell the future. Confucius, what do you think is going to happen in the future? Tell us. And Confucius dismisses them. He says, what happened in the past? The Shang followed the rituals of the Sha, and the Zhu followed the rituals of the Sha. And if in the future we continue to follow the rituals, 10,000 generations from now, you will know exactly what it will be like. So ritual is this important framework for behaving. And how do we behave within that framework? Well, this concept, often translated, it's a tricky one to translate. Humaneness, sometimes benevolence, love, ren, If you know your Chinese characters, you can see that the radicals, there is one for a person, and then there's one for two, right? Two people in relationship. This is the reciprocity as it should be. This is the balance to ritual. So again, I have this quote here. If you rigidly stick to rituals in all matters, there will remain that which you cannot accomplish. If you know enough to value harmonious ease, but try to attain it without being regulated by ritual, this will not work either. Right? You can't just, oh, I have a lot of good feeling. I'm going to get out there and do good. Well, you're not going to do good in the right way, and as a consequence, will do harm. On the other hand, if you just know all the proper ways to do things, you're just going through the motions, as we might say, right? If your heart's not in it, it also isn't going to work. And Confucius is very critical of people on both sides of this angle. You need to have the correct format, framework, ritual for behavior, and then you need to have the virtue. But how do you get the virtue? This is scholarship. Scholarship is very, very important to Confucianism. And scholarship here is a much broader term than we would use scholarship in the West, because remember, the self, there is only the simple inner self. So scholarship is not about adding data to your database. Scholarship is about transforming who you are. So scholarship isn't just law and history and math. It's poetry, it's music, it's sports, it's archery. You have to understand the entire breadth of the human experience. So traditionally, there's 5 classic books that, according to tradition, 2 are written by Confucius, and the other 3 are books that Confucius thought were really good and these should be important. Obviously, over the millennia, this expands. As Confucius says, he says, find inspiration in the odes, the poetry. Take your place to ritual, achieve perfection with music. Confucius is a big lover of music and song. Many of his contemporaries criticize him. They're like, how is this proper scholarship? These guys, they love music so much. What's that about? Confucius understood that music is an important part of who we are. It's part of that holistic context. Confucius says, the poems, the odes, they number over 100, but I can summarize them this: they will not lead your heart astray. And when we talk about leading your heart astray, again, that is in the sense of societal utility. This is not, a way, you will have a sinless life if you love all the poetry. No, none of that. The scholarship changes who you are. This is a very important point. When Confucius talks about his own self, he says, it was not until I was 70 that I was able to follow the desires of my heart without offending virtue. It's not, I am who I am and I need to be true to myself. No. You are who you are. That's not good enough. You need to work to cultivate virtue. Cultivating virtue is done by engaging with things outside of yourself, not by looking within yourself. There is a scholar who comes to Confucius and says, I am very careful to be ethical. I always reflect 3 times before I act. And Confucius says, twice would have been enough. There is this real distaste for being inside your own head. Scholarship is an outward focused thing. One last point is the rectification of names, and this is kind of a tricky one to understand in the Western context. So remembering Confucius' historical position, right? Everyone's going into business for themselves. All of these dukes, counts, and whatever are trying to set up their own fiefdoms. Confucius doesn't like that, right? Let the ruler be the ruler, a minister, the father, a son, a son. One of these families is called the Ji family, and they are kind of setting up almost like a sort of ancient Chinese mafia. They're creating their own power bases within the state. They're not being loyal. They're not serving. And one of the things to do is they have 8 rows of dancers in their courtyard, which is just a ritual thing. By rank, they should only be allowed to have 4. So Confucius says they have 8 dancers in their courtyard. If they can do this, what are they not capable of? If you are capable of disregarding the rules in a little thing like this, how much bigger is that going to be? And more importantly, why are we disregarding the rules? Right? Well, we're disregarding the rules to our own benefit. Right? We don't like the hierarchy. Why? Because we think we ought to be higher up in the hierarchy, right? People who dislike hierarchy, very rarely does it come from a perspective of, it's for other people's sake, right? It's for my own sake. I want to be better. I want to be higher. Or I don't want that person who's above me to be so high. I want to bring them down a little bit. If you don't properly understand, right, the way you relate to someone else, how can you have a relationship that's oriented towards that other person. You need to understand what the relation is in order to be able to perform it. There's also an important notion here of the importance of language. If we can't agree what a word means, how can we have discussion? If we can't have discussion, how can we have society? So the extreme importance on names, titles, positions, and language itself. Okay, so that is, in a summary, Confucian thought. Right? We need to understand that the self is not unchangeable, and the self is not meaningful unless it is in another context. We need to have ritual to guide and shape our behavior. We need to have scholarship to cultivate virtue. Virtue can only be achieved by doing good. Feeling good is not enough. And again, this is all at a very societal level. Confucius makes no statements towards metaphysics. And Confucius and his followers, they form essentially a band of wandering itinerant statesmen, sort of management consultants going around. And so they'll come to a place, a duke will want to talk to Confucius. They'll want to hear all about how do I achieve this harmony and order? And then Confucius will tell them, and generally speaking, the duke will go, oh, sounds like you want me to be virtuous on my own. I don't want to. I want people to obey me. That's what I was kind of looking for. So Confucius will go from place to place. Some of his disciples do very well, and they have very good careers working for this or that person. Confucius himself can never really find anybody he's comfortable working for. He'll do a little bit here and then say, this guy, he doesn't have what it takes. This guy, he's not concerned with society. He's concerned with himself. And at the end of his life, Confucius has quite a lot of popular support among the intelligentsia, among bureaucrats and people, but not at the high level. None of the rulers of his age are particularly interested in hearing what he has to say because they don't like the demands that it puts on them as a ruler. After Confucius dies, things continue to go downhill for China, and we go from a state of decay, anarchy, to outright multi-way civil war. The guy who wins is the ruler of the Qin state. This is where China name comes from, and he is the first emperor of China. And we say that to denote that this guy has a much more centralized and total authority than the dynasties that came before. Those guys they were kings, but this guy is the emperor. And part of that is his chosen philosophy from those 100 schools of thought of legalism, which is kind of what it sounds like, right? He's in charge, I'm the boss, you do what I say. It's about enhancing and concentrating the authority into the monarch. And he conquers everyone, and this works very well. He dies, he passes it off to his son, and his son is pretty much immediately overthrown. And all the Confucians say, aha, right? This is what we said, sure, right? You can give one guy the power, but that doesn't last. That doesn't work on a societal level. And the people who overthrow him form the Han Dynasty. The Han Dynasty, they do like Confucianism. They say, all right, we've got this new, much more streamlined imperial system, but we need to have that flexibility. We need to have that broad expanse. Let's get these Confucian guys in here. So they officially give Confucianism the nod, the court patronage. They also institute the Confucian examination system. If you want to be an administrator or bureaucrat, you've got to pass these Confucian exams, these standardized tests. And this continues throughout the rest of the dynastic period and arguably into the modern East Asian exam system. And these are Confucian exams. So it's not just, hey, what do you know about law? What do you know about history? It's also, analyze this poem for me. Talk about this music. You must be a complete holistic person. And that is how we will decide who's going to be in charge of stuff. I mean, imagine if we did that in our society at the Supreme Court justice hearing. Okay, well, that's some nice legal opinions you wrote, but why don't you pull up the piano, play us a little something. Let's see what you got. The dynasties continue to iterate and modify this as it goes on. So there's a constant desire to syncretize it with whatever the latest religious teaching is, whether that's Taoism, Buddhism, whatever. So it's desyncretization, resyncretization. They kind of modify it, but most of this happens at a very political level. So the scholars and the imperial bureaucrats will be talking about this. But if you're just some farmer, whether or not there's a guy in court working on syncretizing the latest Buddhist teachings with Confucianism, that doesn't really affect you too much. The other thing is, of course, this gets spread all over Asia. So very direct spread to places like Korea, Japan, Vietnam, and then Chinese people that go all over Asia. So places like Singapore and Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines, right? You have people there who also bring this way of thought with them. And this kind of suffuses throughout all of East Asia. So statistically speaking, if you look at the broad human experience, most humans are Confucian. That's the simple statistical fact across all space and time. Now, there's a lot of different takes on it, right? As each dynasty in China proper has a different idea about it. Well, the sort of different interpretations that we have in Vietnam are going to be a little bit different than those, and in Korea and Japan. And you can really get into the weeds on all of these differences, but the basic broad strokes remain the same. So we're going to jump ahead a few thousand years to the Catholics. So the years is about 1500, and the Catholics start showing up in Asia, and they see this Confucian stuff. And these are really the first Westerners who are going to try to take a stab at this. Right? Is it in conflict or is it compatible? If you've ever heard of Matteo Ricci, he is one of these Jesuits who is the first really big and influential missionary to China. Matteo Ricci says, this is very easy for us to combine with. Very minimal work needs to be done here. This works almost perfectly. And he and the Jesuits actually start wearing the Confucian scholarly robes to say, hey, like we're on the same team, guys. The Dominicans and the Franciscans, though they don't like this, they try to get the Pope to ban Confucian practice. And so the popes, they go back and forth, right? This is, the early modern period with papal politics. So whenever the Pope is leaning towards the Jesuit ways, we see that Catholics in China, they're very successful, very popular, a lot of conversion, things are going well. And then when he bans it, it goes the other way. Usually the emperor tries to kick them out. And this is another important point, is that oftentimes when we talk about colonialism, it's this idea, the powerful Westerners, they come and they kick in the door, they're going to do whatever they want. But at this point, the local Asian rulers very much have the upper hand. These missionaries are here on the sufferance of the kings and emperors and shoguns of the lands. They have to make nice. And I'm going to go to the Jesuits in Vietnam as a good example of this, because a little more familiar to me. The Jesuits in Vietnam make a very, very clear effort to draw a direct line between them and the Confucians. And they try to say the Confucians are basically, that's part one, and then we're part two, right? If you follow Confucianism, the logical conclusion is our Catholic practice. And this is, even something a lot of Confucians would agree with. Again, back to Ling Yun Tong, he says, if Confucius were a Christian, he would undoubtedly have been a high churchman, an Episcopalian at the very least, if not a Roman Catholic who speaks only Latin. There is this great love of the ritual and the learning in Confucianism and in the Jesuits. The Jesuits are very careful to frame any dispute that the Buddhists or Taoists or whoever have with them as not Buddhists versus these Western foreigners, but rather Buddhists versus the intellectuals, the Confucians and us, the intellectual team, the scholar team. And do extremely well for them. The Jesuits in Vietnam also go out to create an alphabet for partially for their own use because they can't understand the Vietnamese writing system. But this becomes so easy to use and so popular that it is the writing system that Vietnam uses today. And part of that is also them presenting it, saying, hey, look, we're part of the process, right? We are also intellectuals. We are also part of your society. And in terms of effectiveness, to this day, around 10% of Vietnamese are Catholic. Despite the fact that it is, a communist country that is not in favor of any religion existing. So it's a very, very effective, and I would encourage you, if you have any questions, you can look into a lot of the really interesting work that the Catholic Jesuits have done on how does this harmonize. And that is where we will leave it for today. In part two, we'll kind of get into the modern aspects as well as kind of the more direct ethics of day-to-day life. Are there any questions?
I have so many questions, Nate. You mentioned Taoism and Buddhism just a little bit. I wondered if you could speak just a little bit to like how to think of these things in relationship to each other. Like my vague understanding is there's a lot of like interplay and overlap and integration over the years, but I've just anyway.
Yeah. It's so, like I said, there's a lot of efforts to syncretize and and re-syncretize over the years. So you can find, versions of any of these things that are meshed with the others, as well as versions that are not. Uh, because Confucianism, like Confucius himself, is very explicit. I just care about society and the here and now. It's very easy to mold that onto any kind of spiritual teaching you want. So the Song Dynasty, they really like Buddhism and they really like Confucianism. Let's put the two together, and so you have the Song Dynasty Neo-Confucianism that's very Buddhist. But then, no one else is doing that, so you definitely don't have to. Buddhism obviously is its own thing. It is distinctly religious. It has a lot to say about the nature of man and the nature of the ultimate and how those two connect. And that would be very conflicting with our own Christian understanding of it. Taoism is similar. Taoism is a weird thing because Taoism is, on the one hand, it's sort of this back to nature, civilization has gone too far thing, but it's also there's a lot of arcane, sacred geometry and geomancy and this kind of stuff that Westerners who like Taoism tend to miss for some reason. So Taoism is its own very peculiar thing. But I don't know if that answered your question or not, but they are distinct things. You can interweave them, but you also do not have to.
This examination system strikes me as similar to our constitutional democracy. You've got to have some limits on the rulers or they run amok. And would you think that's comparable?
Yeah. So I will touch on this a little bit on the next one when we talk about Confucianism in the modern times. But there's a lot of scholars who say, how do we interpret this into modern political systems? Right? Does this match a liberal democracy? Does this match a communist dictatorship? Does this match sort of a managed democracy? But there is a big sense in Confucius that the ruler has obligations and limits upon them, which is not something that you're going to see in a lot of other philosophies from the time, right? That's why the first emperor didn't go with Confucianism, went with legalism, which said, hey, you're the boss, you do what you want. He did not want to have this idea there was a moral constraint on him.
Thank you.
Father Bruce has his hand raised, and then there's also a question in the chat, so do that in whatever order.
Father Bruce, yes.
All right, thank you. First of all, thank you very much, Nathan. Very helpful. Really helps me to understand better the Asian students I've had over the years as well. I was interested in your own personal journey. You said your mother followed Confucian teachings, and how did you become a Christian yourself? Would you be able to share that with us?
Like I said, my mother was raised Confucian. My mom does not think of herself in any way Confucian. So Vietnam, obviously a French colony. So my mom was familiar with sort of the French take on Catholicism, not a big fan of it, for obvious reasons. The French didn't exactly make themselves welcome. But it was a very chaotic and confusing time, growing up in Vietnam in the 1670s. So when my mom came to here, she saw some Americans and she was like, hey, I like the way those Pacific people are acting. What is it that they have? What do they got? And then they were Christians. So my mom, became a Christian. So my mom is 100%, she would say, I'm a Christian, that's it. All of the, Confucian concepts that I've talked about, my mom doesn't know any of those vocab words. My mom could explain those concepts to you, right? But not as a distinct concept, but like, this is the way the world works. This is the way a family works. This is the way a relationship works. That's just, it's obvious. What are you talking about? How could anyone pretend otherwise? So my mom raised me in that. I grew up kind of with the sort of generic, Baptist, non-denominational Pacific Northwest thing. And it's okay, but like coming from that Confucian background, it didn't necessarily make a lot of sense, which is why I ended up here in a liturgical setting. That is the short answer.
Thank you.
Let's see, we have. Sorry, I'm going to try to look at some of the chat here if I can.
Yeah, Anna, could you read those questions for us?
Yeah. So Jean had a question. Let me scroll and find it. Hang on. I lost it too. Okay. She's wondering how you know Christ as filtered through Confucianism versus distinct from it. Gene, I'm not sure if I'm rewording your question in a way, but kind of um, filtering through Confucianism versus distinct from Confucianism and where Christ fits in that.
Yeah. I mean, obviously that is a difficult question, right? And the flippant answer is, well, how do you know Christ distinct from Aristotle? How do you know Christ distinct from Plato, right? We're always going to be coming at it from some sort of framework that's going to, be created by a human and therefore be flawed. And obviously the Greek philosophy, it's very influential, but the Hebrews were not party to any of that Greek philosophy. So if you go back and talk to any Hebrew, they're not gonna like that. They're not gonna agree with that. So to what extent, coming from any perspective, are you going to be having to do a lot of heavy lifting? I think one of the things about Confucianism, right, is when we talk about the self needs to be cultivated, self needs to be changed. That kind of necessarily leaves you with like, well, how much can I do, right? To what extent? And I had a Chinese professor who one of her sayings was, do not worry that you are not good enough. You will never be good enough. And that leads you directly into grace, dismerited favor from God. You can never be good enough. My dad likes to say, the reason why all you Vietnamese are so Catholic is because you already have the Asian guilt, so the Catholic guilt doesn't bother you. So yeah, I mean, if you would like to talk about this more in depth, I would be glad to, but I mean, the short answer is there is going to be some conflict, but I think there's less conflict than coming at it from an Aristotelian perspective, but obviously I'm biased.
Can I just jump on the back a little bit more on that?
Yeah.
It's very interesting that you made a special point of saying that Confucius was not interested in metaphysics. And I think that's a helpful perspective as I'm listening and trying to take in what you've laid out here. And it is not the first time I've heard these, because I did study some Asian civilization course a long time ago. So it's like a review for me, but that he doesn't deal with original sin or the sin state of human beings in the sense that Jesus does. He doesn't give answers to those questions. And I think that's that helps me to think about it a little bit in that way, while also valuing many of these concepts that you've laid out. I mean, I love that outward attention on the outward, on the other, what is my role, and on the reciprocity, knowing that you have this care and obedience dynamic going. I love to see more of your thinking about how does that translate into the way we hear what's in the Bible.
Yeah. So I mean, at the level of behavioral ethics, if a man forces you to go with him 1 mile, go with him 2, right? Or by dragging each other to court, have you not already been defeated? There's this emphasis on I need to do my part, right? I'm not transactionally waiting for the other person to do their part. And if we understand that, right, coming from the perspective of, well, hey, I'm an individual, I have rights, that's a very tough pill to swallow. But if we come at that from the perspective of, right, I have this duty towards this other person, that goes down a lot easier. And when we understand, self-sacrificial love, right, as Jesus put it, right, well, how do we try to live that? C.S. Lewis, right, humility is not thinking less of yourself, but thinking of yourself less. Right? Or, my personal favorite, G.K. Chesterton, you ask what is wrong with society? Well, I shall tell you, I am.
Looks like Deborah has a question.
Yeah.
It's not so much a question, but I appreciate this so much. It is wonderful. And what I loved about it is the key part is family. If the family falls apart, then the society falls apart. If we haven't got respect for the dynamic of the God, what God gave us in family, it really does fall apart. And I see that happening so much now. And so I love this. Thank you so much. It's beautiful, hopeful.
Oh, John, please. Thank you.
So I'm just kind of curious about how Confucianism relates to the idea of innovating or like trying to like change things for the better. Like I read a Chinese novel, and I don't know if this is really a Taoist concept more than a Buddha or more than a Confucian concept, but one of the things that really, it wasn't explicit, but I really absorbed over the whole story was like the futility of human effort and striving, and how like the harder you try, the more you're just going to be disappointed. And so like, true wisdom is to kind of like let go and have no desires. And so maybe that's more Taoist or whatever, but I'm hearing some of the same thing here in the Confucianism of like, follow the old ways. People have already figured it out. Stay in your lane, kind of like, just, live your little part as it has come to you, and, don't try too hard. I don't, does that, your thoughts?
Yes. So, that idea of, futility of effort, that is a very Taoist thing. Obviously, when we're going back thousands of years, it's kind of hard to say, well, like, what is this versus that versus just sort of, Asian culture in general. It gets very muddy. I will say like that is, what I'll discuss in kind of the modern section. Next one is that is kind of a thing as there's the rise of imperialism and colonialism. That is the question that is being asked, is like, is this Confucianism a thing that's holding us back, or is it something that we need to kind of get back to the roots of in some way? So yes, you can read it as, stay in your place, don't do anything new, right? But you don't necessarily, again, have to. So it is going to depend a lot on the person, right? And you can take any human philosophy and make it into a way of maintaining the power dynamic of the existing blah blah blah. You can put a little materialist dialectical perspective on it if you want, but you don't have to. I think that is kind of the blind spot that Confucianism would veer more to as opposed to Western philosophy. I think that is the benefit of be able to take a view of both.
We have one more question in the chat. Oh, sorry.
No, that's all you go for it.
Okay, one more question in the chat, and I'll just read the whole thing. They say, I really appreciated your explanation of reciprocity in relationships. It seems to be that if I am in relationship with another, I may be held back from achieving my own successes. However, because I am not looking out for just myself, I am in a relationship, so I give up my own desires for the benefit of the other. Is that right? I think it's a clarifying question about how you mesh and mold the desires of the people in a relationship.
Yeah, that is a good explanation. Again, with this notion that the basic unit of society is the family, not the individual. So what's good for you is not really a question any more than, what's good for your leg is a question over what's good for your entire self. If it's necessary to hurt your leg to preserve your entire self, you're gonna do it, no question. If something's coming towards your head, you're gonna raise your arm. And that is kind of the context in which we think of it. Again, the goal of Confucius is the society-wide flourishing. And so, yes, it is possible that I might not get what's best for me, but the question isn't what's best for me, it's what's best for the people to whom I owe duties to.
I can see this as a how to succeed in business course in ancient China. You figure out who's in charge, you play the game by their rules, and it works kind of like American corporate business. And maybe this is Andrew Carnegie's course for ancient China.
I like that.
Okay. Nate, this is brilliant. Thank you so much. This is a 2-session seminar. Can you give us a preview of what we can expect next week?
All right, so next week we will come into the modern. We will discuss kind of how do we interpret Confucianism in the modern one. I have 3 specific angles I'd like to take. 3 guys who put their own spin on it, who say, yes, Confucianism, but. And if you know anything about Asian history, you might know some of these names. They are Zhou Enlai, Lee Kuan Yew, and Gordon Yin. And we're going to look at that, as well as sort of the behavioral ethics of how we live in the modern day, and also, more Q&A. And I would be glad to discuss more there, or also if you want to talk to me just, mano a mano, I can do that as well.
Yeah, just marvelous. Brothers and sisters, we are a thinking, thoughtful church, and I love that we can investigate these sorts of things. I actually think our Christian commitments demand it. As I was listening to Nate, I immediately went to Acts 17 and just Paul's robust knowledge and awareness of the cultural philosophies of his day. And I think we have an obligation to respond in kind and think in kind. So Nate, I just publicly just want to thank you for the amount of work that you invested in this seminar, and I'm so enlivened by it. I have a lot more reading to do after a session like this, so that's humbling and also just great fun to contemplate. Can we pray together? And I'll send you all on your merry way. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, I thank you for Nate. I thank you for the kinship that we share with him as a brother in Christ. I thank you for the beauty of his mind, and just what a grace it's been to sit for an hour under his instruction and to learn about Confucianism and the ways in which it's shaped his awareness of you and his response to you, and the way in which I think millions of Christians will come to the faith from this cultural philosophy. So we thank you for these seminars and this opportunity to think deeply about the good, the right, and the beautiful. And I pray it would lead us inexorably to your truth. We give you thanks in the name of Jesus. Amen. Thanks all. Have a lovely week, and we'll see you here next week. Indeed. Yeah.